Welcome to the recorded version of the Grantmakers in Aging web seminar, Building Resilience, Older Adults, Disasters, and Philanthropy, featuring Jenny Campbell, Grantmakers in Aging Program Evaluator, Community Agenda and Adjunct Faculty at the Graduate School of Social Work at Bryn Mawr College, Mark Gorman, Director of Strategic Development for HelpAge International, and John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging. From February 24, 2014. This event was made possible by a partnership between Grantmakers in Aging and the John A. Hartford Foundation. Technical and production support is provided by the American Society on Aging.
Thanks very much, Steve, and welcome to everyone who is attending today's important session. As Steve mentioned, this is part of our monthly Conversations with GIA series, and we are always delighted to have new people attend, and I know that we have some new ones today. Our session today is on building resilience, older adults, disasters, and philanthropy, and we are very thankful to have the John A. Hartford Foundation of New York for their continuing support of this series, which makes it possible for us to bring this to you once a month. We also want to thank the expert team at the American Society on Aging for providing technical and Typhoon Haiyan and Superstorm Sandy are stark reminders that even in the most horrific disasters, older adults will be disproportionately affected. Why are older adults particularly vulnerable in disasters? What are the implications for immediate response and long-term recovery process? Can planning and preparation mitigate these vulnerabilities? What is disaster risk reduction? And how might it affect older adults? What are some of the challenges in responding to the needs of older adults after a disaster? And how can philanthropy respond to these unexpected events in ways that target and support older adults through the recovery process? In this webinar, our speakers will share best practices for helping communities and philanthropists respond to the needs of older adults in times of catastrophic events. We are very pleased to have two of the world's experts in this area. Mark Gorman is Director of Strategic Development for HelpAge International in London. HelpAge is a leading international charity focused on the elderly and was on the ground in the Philippines immediately following Typhoon Haiyan, where they are working closely with their local partner, the Coalition of Services for the Elderly. Jenny Campbell is Grantmakers in Aging Program Evaluator for Community Agenda, our project on age-friendly communities, and adjunct faculty member at the Graduate School of Social Work at Bryn Mawr College in Greater Philadelphia area. She also helped to create and administer the Hurricane Fund for the Elderly, a GIA-sponsored effort to coordinate philanthropy to serve older persons after Hurricane Katrina. We welcome you both. If we could have the next slide, please. Mark, let's start with you. When we talk about building resilience for older people, what are you talking about there?
Well, thank you, John. First of all, thank you for the invitation to join the seminar today. It's a really interesting, exciting opportunity from the other side of the Atlantic. I think when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the capacity of older people to be as prepared as possible for natural disasters and political emergencies that occur. Obviously, these occur without warning or with very little warning, and therefore it's important to build capacity before a disaster occurs. And then when the emergency happens, to enable older people, to support them to survive as best they can through the emergency phase, and then to be able to recover from the emergency in as sustainable a way as possible. Now, obviously, for older people who may be frailer or less capable physically or perhaps even mentally than the main adult population, resilience must have different meanings. And when we talk about building resilience, I think we're thinking in terms of how best to reach this particularly vulnerable group and how best to support them to enable them to survive through a major emergency.
This slide that we're on here it talks about older persons' risks in natural disasters and political emergencies. Could you give us some examples of these kinds of events?
Yeah, I've listed 3 or 4 different types of disasters here. We always talk in terms of natural disasters and political or even complex political emergencies. And natural disasters like the tsunami 10 years ago now, like the Haiti earthquake, and indeed like the Philippines typhoon the end of last year. These are major events which are coming even more frequently than they have been in the past, and affect large numbers of people. And in low-income countries, when we talk about the impacts and effects, they are often very different in terms of loss of life, in terms of damage to infrastructure, and in terms of injury and trauma than those that occur, bad as they are, in Europe and North America. And then the other side of the coin is conflict. And unfortunately, the world is beset by ongoing conflict, not only in the African continent, I've mentioned a couple here, but also, as we've seen over the last couple of years, in the Middle East, and trying to respond to these very different types of emergencies is a particular challenge, especially when dealing with a group like older people who face specific threats.
So we move to the next slide. What are some of the risks that older people face?
Well, I think they are, in some ways, they're the same as other groups face, and in other ways they're very different. For example, when we compare older people with children, the need for protection in the immediate aftermath of emergencies of all kinds is often a paramount issue, both for vulnerable children who may have been left on their own and for vulnerable older adults. But in some ways the needs are the same, but in many ways they are very distinct and very different. And I've listed just a few here. Because of older people's relatively reduced mobility, and because they therefore find it very difficult to reach assembly points and food points and health centres, they often miss out on what's available in the general community. And I think this is a key issue. Older people can quickly become very invisible in emergency situations, simply because they are often immobilized in their own homes. We saw that particularly in the tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami, along the Indian Ocean coast. Rather ironically, the population most affected was the active working population who were out and about on the early morning when the tsunami hit, and older people often were left at home and lost their whole families in the emergency. This photograph shows an old lady and her daughter, a nearly 90-year-old lady and her 60-something-year-old daughter in the Philippines. And this is what can happen to somebody's home in an emergency. And of course, these two were left in the immediate aftermath with no support, no shelter. And for very elderly people, obviously very isolated and very exposed. And just finally, just to mention here the trauma and isolation. I mentioned the tsunami, and I think what we noticed in the tsunami was the number of older people who, because they lost many friends and relatives, said that they had lost everything and really lost the will to carry on, because there seemed to be no point in continuing. They thought there was nothing left for them. And bad as it was for people at younger ages, there was a sense in which they could rebuild. And I think quite often for older people, the trauma of an emergency, a disaster, is such that they feel it's ended everything. And that's something that we really need to try to address and support people through.
As we move on to the next slide, are these hazards that you've described well understood, and are they attended to in disasters?
Well, the disaster relief agencies, the United Nations and the big international organizations like Save the Children, Oxfam and so on, they do a great job in emergencies. They are the ones who do the infrastructure work. They often will put back a water supply system, which smaller agencies like ourselves couldn't possibly take on. And they say that they reach out to the general population and that they cater for older people within that. We think that is sometimes happens. It's very variable, though, and the response can be very inconsistent. And I was once in Mozambique and watching a clothing distribution, which we had contributed to, and the clothes being distributed in a assembly point from the back of a truck. And we were looking for the older people. The older people are nowhere to be seen in the huge lines that formed around the truck. And we found them sitting under a tree, literally at the back of the line. And they were not about to join in the mayhem that was going on. And I think this was a general distribution, and I think the agency involved would have felt that they were doing a good job, which they were, but they weren't reaching the whole community. So I think that's something that we work on with our friends and colleagues, particularly from the disability organisation as well, who face many of the same problems. So I think we've made progress, but there's still much more to do.
As we move to the next slide, how do health conditions play into this situation?
Well, as I say here, health is a key challenge, and there tends to be at the beginning of a disaster, quite rightly and understandably, a focus on first aid, on immediate response, on dealing with the injuries and traumas that people have suffered. But after that initial first phase, the health response becomes rapidly much more complex, and health services do really need to be built to respond to older people's needs, and those are needs which actually may derive from the emergency itself, like injury or trauma, but also issues that arise because in the aftermath of emergency, because say water and sanitation breaks down and diseases like cholera are always a menace in post-disaster situations, and older people are particularly vulnerable to those. But also we see a lot of people with long-term conditions, for example, hypertension, diabetes and so on, who need medication, whose supplies have been lost. And we've been encouraging many of the larger agencies to include in their emergency relief packs, their drug supply packs, to include drugs which are appropriate for older people. Antihypertensive drugs, for instance, extremely important. And also, as I've mentioned here, those basic aids to mobility, to hearing, to sight, which are not only important because they're nice to have, but they can be literally a matter of life and death, because a pair of glasses for an older person with impaired vision means that they become much more mobile. They can actually reach distribution points, and that can be very critical because often in emergencies, distributions and health services are at fixed points. There are very few outreach services, and so that is a really important asset for older people to have. So I think there are a number of different needs here that we need to address at different points in the emergency.
On the next slide, you talk about older people can be assets in emergencies. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I think that we first came across this in many years ago, back in the late 80s and early 90s in the Sahel region of West Africa, the region that borders the Sahara Desert. And we were dealing with a series of droughts in countries along that region, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. And in many communities, it was older people who were holding the community together because they had experienced not one drought or two droughts over 10 years, but perhaps 3 or 4 or more over their whole lifetime, sometimes major drought disasters. And they had the experience to survive. They are the bearers of knowledge and experience. And they are often, very frequently in emergencies, it's very important to have people in the community who know the community. And agencies look for the key informants. And those key informants often are older people, community leaders who have respect in the community. And I just wanted to emphasize this point that older people are not only victims of disasters. I've been talking so far as though it always is the vulnerability of older people that we need to focus on. Of course, that is important. But they also can be active parts of the response.
On the next slide, we have a photo. Tell us about what's going on here.
Well, this is practicing the response. Some years ago, about 10 years ago in Latin America, in Bolivia, groups of older people began to get together. In fact, the first group got together, sorry, I'm wrong, it was in Peru, the first group got together. And they got together because they saw emergencies happening, disasters like localized floods, for instance, where the response was quick but not immediate, and where things needed to be done, people needed to be supported and helped immediately in the community. So in Peru and later in Bolivia, they formed what they called the White Brigades, the silver-haired older people meeting together as groups and training to become, and in fact working with civil defense associations as this is an example from La Paz in Bolivia, where a local civil defense group and a White Brigade group have got together to run a training session for older people, working with, in this case, other older people, but they also work at different levels in the community, with different age groups in the community. And we've seen most recently in the Philippines a significant mobilization through our local partner, which brought numbers of older people from Manila and other cities in the Philippines to support the relief effort in the disaster-affected areas. So this is older people helping other older people. And of course, many of them are retired doctors and nurses who have the necessary skills, the skills that agencies are crying out for when they get into emergency situations and need immediate support. So here's a group of older people who are not vulnerable, but who are actually capable and able to give support when it's needed.
It's a very inspiring story. On the next slide, we return as we sort of wrap up this part of the session on what do we need to do to make this situation better?
Okay, well, I've just sort of divided this into two, and I think at the top level, I think what I've mentioned a number of times, sort of working with humanitarian agencies, the disaster relief organizations, and also working with the policymakers simply at one level to make them aware of the fact that there are significant numbers of older people, even in low-income countries, and significant numbers affected by disasters. And therefore, hence the need to include those people in the response. And they can be included both because they're vulnerable and because they can offer resource to responders. So I think it's at that global level, that top level, we need to raise that awareness, to make people aware, because frankly, people are not aware. There's still a huge lack of understanding of the transformation in terms of the rise in the numbers and proportions of older people, even in the populations of low-income developing countries.
And on the next slide, what are the other things that we need to be doing?
Yeah, well, and finally, this is a more specific level, and we at HelpAge have done a lot of work over the last 10 years, not only in our disaster response, but actually learning from those responses and really trying to feed that into material, guidelines, technical resources, which we can offer to other agencies. We've also developed training modules, and we've encouraged other agencies to include modules on aging and older people's needs in the training of their managers who are working in humanitarian relief, in disaster relief. Very importantly, we've been advocating for better data collection, sex and age disaggregated data collection, so that we can actually tell the story of what's needed. We have some data from the Philippines, and actually the data from the Philippines shows that despite the fact that older people are less than 1 in 10 of the Filipino population, the estimate is that nearly half of those who died during the typhoon were older people over the age of 60. And it's that sort of data which actually those sorts of shocking figures which we need both to make the case, but also, more as importantly, to ensure that next time we have the data before the disaster to enable us to pinpoint where the resources will be needed. And I think, well, the last 2 points, I think, catering for older people, in particular program design, ensuring that nutrition programs, that food programs have appropriate food for older people, and above all, consulting older people themselves, asking older people themselves about how programs should be set up and implemented, is a critical and key factor in the future success of these programs in disaster relief.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your insights, particularly on the international scale. And as we move to the next slide, I want to remind our audience that at the end of our session, after Jenny Campbell's talk, we will be turning to your questions. I will be reading the questions to our panelists. So there is on the box on your screen, there is a section called questions. Just open that up and type in your questions at any point during our session, and I'll be turning to those in a few minutes. So as we move to the next slide, Jenny, what are some of the challenges for philanthropy in finding a way that would help in disasters in a way that really is responsive and helpful?
Well, there are a number of things that are challenges for philanthropy in responding to a disaster, that oftentimes the timetable of a disaster and the immediacy of the need is not necessarily well fitted for philanthropy in a slow, thoughtful way of rolling out how they respond. So oftentimes there's a mismatch of the events around a disaster, but there are ways that philanthropy can play a very, very important role in responding to a disaster for older adults. So some of the challenges are that disasters are unplanned events. It's not something you can put into a strategic plan and say, in our area, if some sort of disaster happens, we will do the following. And so that uncertainty ends up being a challenge for philanthropy. Disaster philanthropy often requires really quick decisions. There's an immediate need for aid. There's an immediate need for commitments of funding, something that philanthropy does not really work well with. There's also a need to find a credible partner. HelpAge International has excellent examples in terms of identifying a trusted partner on the ground that can really help them understand what the capacity of the region is and what the capacity of this organization is to respond to a disaster, because there's always the question about whether or not the funds from philanthropy will be used well, and everybody is certainly concerned about making sure that it's being given to an organization that can be effective. There's also a lot of confusion about government responsibility in a disaster. In the United States, what is the government responsible for? What do the Aging Services Network, what are they responsible for? And what is truly left an unmet need? And finally, philanthropy often has restrictions on geographical zones of giving, which make it difficult. I've heard from a number of philanthropic organizations saying, gee, I really wanted to do something, but we have these constrictions about our funding.
So we go to the next slide. How do foundations differ in how they respond?
Well, some foundations, I think there's a question in terms of what is the timing of what a foundation can give to, and what are their regular funding priorities. So in their funding priorities, might there be a way that they could match up with some of the needs in a disaster? In a disaster, there are 4 different areas of funding, which are on the slide. Most people think in terms of just disaster response, responding right away to an actual disaster. It's getting food, water, shelter, very immediate needs into an area that had been devastated. But there are a number of other parts of disaster giving that have different kinds of timelines. One is mitigation, the first one that's listed there, which is preventing future disasters. You have an area that's prone to flooding. It floods on a regular basis. There can be a philanthropic agenda around helping to change that so that there won't be future disasters. That's disaster funding that's on a very different sort of a timeline than disaster response. There's also disaster preparedness, that oftentimes when a disaster hits, such as Katrina, there were a lot of different initiatives to disaster-proof older adults, if you will, of making sure that people had plans about where to evacuate, what to take with them, had access to their medications if they did need to evacuate. Those kinds of disaster preparedness things make a population more resilient. It gives them confidence that if something unexpected should happen, they are prepared to go. They're prepared to do what needs to be done. And then finally, there's also disaster recovery, which is returning the affected community back to the pre-disaster state or better. And oftentimes there are rebuilding questions after a disaster of, do you just rebuild what was there before, or do you try to enhance it? So mitigation, disaster preparedness, and disaster recovery all work on a very different timeline than disaster response, and there may be some very good opportunities for philanthropy to take advantage of those timelines.
As we move on to the next slide, what are some of the special issues in disasters that involve older people?
Well, tailoring disaster philanthropy to older adults it's tricky. One is that we've already touched on is finding a trusted partner in the disaster zone who understands the needs of older adults and can kind of work pulling in partners, putting together coalitions as needed. There's also remembering to care for the caregivers. It's a very important part about what happens in a disaster with older adults, that oftentimes the caretakers who are trying to keep an older adult safe and managing through the different stages that Mark just talked about, they often have needs of being able to really get the support they need in order to then support the older adults. There's the convening power of philanthropy. Philanthropy may not have tremendous funds to give in a specific situation, but they can pull together the key partners, the important go-to people in a community to talk about what needs to happen and what needs to happen next. having an expert in terms of aging, knowing what was happening for older adults in that community is an important part of that. Another piece really underscores another part that Mark was talking about is the effectiveness of peer-to-peer programming with older adults, of using older adults who have had a lot of experience, oftentimes a lot of experience with disasters. They've been through a lot, and they can be a real asset after a disaster of part of the recovery process, and making sure that if there is philanthropic giving, that it's really being aware of how to support older adults being used as an asset. And finally, helping older adults rebuild resilience as part of the recovery process. And that resilience is going to look very different according to the population, according to the location, and also according to the kind of disaster that they have experienced.
On the next slide, then, what else have we learned from our experience in these areas?
Well, I think the good news, and I mean, what I have found very exciting in terms of the work that I've done and the reading that I've done and talking to different leaders about disaster work, is there is a lot of creative work that comes out of disasters. You wouldn't wish a disaster on anybody, obviously. It's a terrible, traumatic thing. But oftentimes there are creative solutions that emerge. You see new leaders, you see new organizations, you see new initiatives. And philanthropy has an opportunity to be that catalyst, to really help to be that spark, to look for those innovations post-disaster and to support those ways of really building things back better and having a more supportive and a more resilient community. There's also the opportunity to use very small grants. Oftentimes, philanthropy in a disaster, they will have their typical grant giving, which may be in a larger amount that they typically give. But for disaster philanthropy, they can do small grants, and they can do things that will help fund and fuel and catalyze different solutions. So thinking about small grants is a really a helpful way to think about disaster philanthropy. And finally, I think that there is a piece of disaster philanthropy where you just may not have the same level of return on investments that the regular grants do, that go through a slow, vetted process, are voted upon, reflected upon, refined, and delivered in terms of programming. So preparing organizations that are interested in doing disaster philanthropy to think about what their expectations are and whether or not those are realistic expectations in a disaster is another important component.
And our next slide, are there success stories in this process?
Well, there are, and I think a lot of organizations that have been really successful in terms of philanthropy and aging are organizations that have had aging they have them on their horizon. They are concerned about funding things specifically in aging, and that when a disaster has hit, they have really drilled down on what the needs of older adults are and look to do funding specifically around older adults. The AARP Foundation did a really remarkable job post-Katrina, where they raised funds from members and from staff. A lot of them were very small donations. They were personal donations, but they ultimately ended up funding $3.5 million in 4 rounds of funding to help rebuild the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. It was really a remarkable effort. They have gone on to do funding for different disasters that have happened, whether or not it was a Haiti earthquake or Hurricane Sandy, the Oklahoma tornadoes, where they have raised funds and allocated them. The Altman Foundation and the New York Community Trust Foundation did giving after Hurricane Sandy up in the New York area, and they were specifically concerned about developing recommendations to reduce the impact to older adults in future disasters. And then finally, the John A. Hartford Foundation had also done some very, very exciting funding around looking at the needs of nursing homes in a disaster following Hurricane Katrina, and that's produced some work that has been really helpful in so many different ways. And finally, the Grantmakers in Aging Hurricane Fund for the Elderly, where we were able to partner with a number of different philanthropic groups and fund a number of new initiatives in the Gulf states after Hurricane Katrina, and bringing, I think it was $4.8 million of new funding to the Gulf state area to rebuild senior services. So there are some examples of organizations that have said, we may not be a disaster organization per se. We may not just be serving older adults, but there are ways that we can rise to this occasion.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. I do want to remind the audience that we are now going to turn to the section where we're going to be asking questions of our panelists. So if you have a question, just open that section on the box that's on your screen and type that in. But I will start with one that I'll ask Mark first, but I think, Jenny, you also will be able to respond. And it basically revolves around the difference between short-term and medium-term needs. So in the short term, there's a lot of media attention, there's a lot of local attention, there's a lot of response in a variety of ways, some of which is helpful, some of which may not be. But then, let's say 6 months out, what happens? So the question is around in the medium time frame, say 6 months to a year. What's the most useful way in which philanthropy and other people can be involved in this process? Mark, let's start with you on that one.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right, John, that there is huge attention at the beginning and great pressure to spend money quickly, ironically at the very moment when it's most difficult to spend appropriately in terms of being able to buy supplies and equipment and so on fast. But actually, I think the humanitarian community has begun to address that issue in recent years, and via systems of stockpiling, via sharing resources, joint purchases, and so on. And the real challenge does come a little later, as you say, 6 months to 12 months down the road, when the immediate disaster has passed, but actually the ongoing emergency at a low level continues for many people. And so I think there the accent really needs to be on trying to ensure that the services that have been established as the disaster struck or in the aftermath of the disaster, like health services, community support and so on, that they are able to be sustained through the next period. And to do that, I think it's really important for agencies to be able to bridge the gap where government, particularly in our context, in the developing world context, where government may not have the resources to immediately build infrastructure, that agencies are able to continue to run the emergency services, the health services, to run the emergency camps, and hopefully to provide that bridge to building back, as Jenny was saying, and hopefully building back better. It is that period though, and we'll see that with in the Philippines, I'm sure, which is is a country with potential to rebuild the infrastructure, but needs support to do it, and needs that period, or the bridging period, to enable that to happen. And it's actually it will be sort of from late spring through the rest of this year that will be a critical period for the Philippines.
Jenny?
It's a very interesting question, because I think in terms of the size of the disaster, the kind of disaster, and the infrastructure that existed prior to the disaster will all end up influencing what the timing is. For areas that have high capacity perhaps a small area that was devastated, but that the area has capacity, you'll see it very quickly. The services that they need are there, they're rebuilt, and things happen very quickly. In other areas, they don't have that resilience to begin with, and there may be, very significant service problems in terms of having adequate services to begin with. The timing issue will be very, very different. So I think the lesson for philanthropy is to remain in touch with the disaster, about what's happening, of following the updates out of that and seeing what the needs are that emerge. Some of those needs are still going to be, very acute needs months later, and there are other ones that will need really much more nuanced, more like planning support rather than actual services. So it will be highly individual according to the area. I think the real risk is to wander away, and you follow the disaster in the headlines, and as it gets knocked off the headlines and replaced by other news, oftentimes the energy of looking at that site and looking for services and looking for what the needs are ebbs. So philanthropy really has a role of keeping the attention on that area, regardless of, how those needs change over time.
Well, this next question then is in some ways a follow-up to that, and I'll start with you, Jenny, because you've already raised it. And it's about the visibility of the most high-profile places that receive news attention versus those that don't. And I think, Jenny, you probably saw a pretty graphic example of this in the justifiably strong attention paid to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina versus places like rural Mississippi, where there was a strong sense that no one ever came, no one ever asked whether they needed anything, no one ever showed up. And so is there a way that philanthropy can be involved in that process if you see that happening?
Yeah, I definitely do see that happening, and it's much easier in the urban areas where there's a high concentration of people to go in to take pictures, to do interviews. It's much harder to move into the more rural areas and to really understand what that has meant. And I think philanthropy has a real role in keeping that light on and shining it on and asking questions and following up with local organizations, talking to other different community foundation philanthropies, but to really dig into some of the rural areas that haven't gotten all the hoopla, but are still really in a devastating circumstances.
Mark, do you see that as well?
Right. Yeah, I think that we see that situation of pockets of anonymity. We see it with older people. As I mentioned before, they can become invisible, even when the services, when they're in a camp situation, for example, and the services are available. They just don't seem to be able to sort of reach those services. But I think I'd certainly support what Jenny is saying about the role that philanthropy can play in actually keeping the issue on the agenda, because I think that is hugely important. I mentioned before that the issue of older people in disasters is still one that we find very difficult to get the major agencies to engage with. And I think there's a certain measure, I think, where these agencies feel here comes HelpAge again with their special pleading for older people. And I think we need others to be saying, to be raising the issue too, so that we have a number of authoritative voices who are able to speak. And I think actually that the experience from Katrina and disasters in the US and in UK and Europe, where data has been collected, information is known, is highly relevant to engage policymakers, because we see so many of the same issues that emerge in these disasters repeated in disasters in the developing world. So I think there is a read across that philanthropy can make with with policymakers in the major agencies to convince them about the need to address the issues of sort of forgotten populations in disasters.
If I could add to that, there was a lot of pushback in terms of when we were doing Hurricane Katrina and talking about the needs of older adults, and people saying, no, our priorities are work and school and housing for our workers, and as soon as we get all of that done, then we'll worry about the older adults. But it was very difficult to get prioritization in terms of what was happening with older adults and also advocating for what the services are, so that we really do need to have a community voice going forward about the importance of paying attention to what was happening for older adults. At one point I was told, it's like, we're not going to talk about transportation services for older adults in New Orleans. They shouldn't be here. So it's certainly very disturbing conversations, but I think very indicative of a larger kind of underpinning of the invisibility of older adults.
Yeah. A question that you had raised a little bit earlier, Jenny, a couple people are asking about foundations and other philanthropy that really is strictly local. So if we're only funding in this county or in this community or this region, how do we connect best with the resources that are available nationally or internationally? And then how do we use our knowledge of the community to help national groups, which sometimes I think kind of appear out of nowhere sometimes, and may and obviously don't have the strong connections to the community already in place. Mm-hmm. So I'll start with you, Jenny, on that one.
Okay. I do think that, oftentimes I talk to a number of different foundations that we're really struggling with. We really wanted to give after Hurricane Katrina, and it's just outside of our geographical scope. People really were able to use their skills in terms of philanthropy, in terms of community organizing, in terms of their knowledge about older adults, to help think through some of the problems that the area was having, to advocate with policymakers and government agencies about what was happening with older adults, to reach out to organizations that were in the devastated area to find out what sort of help they needed and figure out what sort of help they might provide, because there's a brain trust piece of this in addition to dollars. So it's not just, if you can't give us money, then just walk away. There was a lot that we could collectively really think through. So I saw examples of a number of people really play very pivotal roles in the region without their organizations actually donating money.
I think that's an important thing to remember, because we've now been conditioned, certainly in the United States, to, don't send a blanket, send a check. Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely correct, I think. But on the other hand, you don't want people to ignore the non-monetary things.
Right.
Mark, anything to add on that one?
Well, I just to reinforce what Jenny was saying in terms of the international scene as well. I think I'm not very familiar with the U.S. philanthropy community in relation to aging, but I do recognize this problem or issue of the restricted remit. But I think, as Jenny is saying, it's not just about money. It's also about the thinking power, the experience that can be contributed. And many of the, as I said before, many of the issues that are faced and challenges faced in disaster emergencies in the developed world have their mirror image in developing countries, often though with an infrastructure which is much more fragile. But often there's a lot of learning that can be contributed. And I think that's something also between emergencies. It's not just at the time of the emergency when we tend to think of these things, but actually, there will be, unfortunately, there will be more disasters, and perhaps they'll become more frequent. And there are many things that we know that we can do. In countries like Bangladesh, for example, they've hugely reduced mortality toll from floods. simply by learning how to prepare, how to mitigate, and how to respond. And the learning that they've done can be extended into the learning around working with older populations, people with disabilities, and that's where I think philanthropy can play a big role in terms of sharing experience and knowledge.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. So this is a question from someone from the outside the philanthropic community asking about, are there any guidelines or suggestions you might have to effectively work with the philanthropic communities in terms of disasters that from your experience? So Jenny, you've been on both sides of this equation in terms of both seeking funds and also administering this program. So I'll start with you again. But the question around, if you're looking for help in this kind of situation, what's the best way to approach this?
Well, the best way to approach it is to start before the disaster, which is really hard to do in terms of timing. But that developing relationships with your local funders, knowing who they are, knowing what their priorities are, them knowing about you, about the work that you do, will make it much more possible to move into a very different kind of high gear relationship if and when a disaster hits. So having that relationship, so the great quote that I heard about this is that starting to hand out business cards and introduce yourself is not the best thing to do while running from a disaster. That those relationships that you've established prior to the disaster are the ones that are really going to take you through. Steve, if we could go to the next slide. There is an article that I wrote about philanthropy, disasters, and older adults, which is on the GIA website, which really is a much more in-depth discussion in terms of philanthropy and older adults. So I think there are some things there that you will find interesting. But know who your local funders are, know what your local community funding is, find ways to get to know them. It's not just, you don't want to be making, just contacting them to say, give me a grant, but you really want to have time for philanthropy to know what you do, what the story is, what your role in terms of working with older adults disasters is, so that you're really setting yourself up for a future relationship, regardless of whether or not a disaster occurs. John,
Mark?
would you add anything to that?
Mark, anything to add?
Again, Jenny is the expert in the field, but I just would add that from our perspective, I suppose our parallel sort of structures are that we work together with a number of, in our case, UK agencies who are associated in an organisation called the Disasters Emergency Committee, where 14 organisations have come together. And we collectively make appeals, but we also report back. I think it's really important that to make the connection with potential donors, but also that there is a responsibility to report back on what's been done with the money that's been donated. And I think that helps to build confidence over the long term that that money is being used appropriately. I mean, we now have very strict guidelines about how money is to be spent and audits of how that's done, and that's all part of the report back. But it's not just about the money; it's also a report back about what's been done in order to to respond effectively to help people through disaster. And so I think I would echo what Jenny is saying. It's that dialogue over time which is really important to establish that confidence.
At this point, we're going to turn from our questions and give our panelists a chance to provide any final thoughts that they may have for our audience. So, Jenny, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I do think that the disasters and philanthropy and older adults lens gives us a really interesting way of thinking about older adults, thinking about how we support older adults in our community and what our services are like when that vulnerability is really threatened, so that using the idea of a disaster, using the idea of what we have learned about older adults in a disaster really gives us a way to enhance what our services are and how we think about caring for our vulnerable populations in our communities. So I really appreciate having an opportunity to talk about these pieces of that very important equation.
Mark?
Yeah, I think I was very taken by Jenny's phrase about creative solutions emerging from disasters, and no one wants to see a disaster occur. But I think we need to use the opportunity that we've been given, the responsibility we've been given through the funds that have been donated and support that we've got to look for those solutions. And I agree that it is actually in disaster situation where you see the way that people respond and react to older people, for good and ill, and I think that we can learn hugely from disasters and must learn from disasters in order to mitigate sort of future problems. So I think like Jenny, I feel this has been a really interesting opportunity to open this dialogue, and I hope it perhaps could continue.
Well, thanks to both of you. I want to thank Mark Gorman, the Director of Strategic Development for HelpAge International, and Jenny Campbell, the Program Evaluator for Community Agenda and Adjunct Faculty at Bryn Mawr College, for their participation in today's program. We thank you for all you do to make life better for older adults around the world. I also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this program, as well as the American Society on Aging for their technical expertise. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.